I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. Welcome to Season 6, Episode 1. We have a special climate politics focused show to open the new season. It's a time of elections here in Canada and the US. On October 19th, residents of British Columbia will go to the polls, choose between David Eby's BC NDP, the current Progressive Governing Party, and the BC Conservatives, led by John Rustad, someone we can charitably call a climate skeptic. Then on November 5th, Americans face their own stark contrast between Kamala Harris and her Democrat colleagues and Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Lastly, though nothing has been called federally in Canada, a few things have happened in the past 2 weeks that will likely lead to an election earlier than required under law. The leading contender to be Canada's next Prime Minister, Pierre Poilievre, has said that he will abolish Canada's consumer-facing carbon tax as one of his first acts of Parliament, a position that is supported by several prominent progressive politicians across Canada. So far, in none of these current and future elections, does climate policy factor in as a priority for voters the way it did in recent ones. Can climate still be a winning issue for progressive candidates? How did proponents of the consumer-facing carbon tax, like David, Sarah, and me, fail to make it politically resilient? And given its gravity, why does climate persist to be a left-right oppositional issue instead of a post-partisan one? To help us make sense of the political dimensions of climate past and present, David and I chatted with the inimitable Stephen Carter of the Strategists podcast. Best known as one of Canada's leading political strategists, he played a leadership role in the rise of Mayor Naheed Nenshi, Premier Alison Redford, and Mayor Jyoti Gondek. The National Post, CBC, and other political commentators have described him as a political mastermind. He joined us for a recorded conversation from his home in Calgary, Alberta. A reminder that Sarah's on medical leave for the time being, so it's just David and me speaking with Stephen. We look forward to having Sarah back on EBC as soon as she's able to be back. Now here's the show. Stephen Carter, welcome to Energy versus Climate.
Thank you very much. I don't know which side I'm on. I'm pretty excited.
We'll figure that out. Before we go any further, David, do you have any cards to put on the table with regards to election campaigning on climate?
It's a lot less important than it used to be. It's clear that climate is not near the top of the Canadian election campaign, which will kick off soon, whatever soon means. And it sure as heck isn't very close to the top of the U.S. election campaign, which is fighting itself out now.
So let's use these upcoming elections as a jumping off point to talk about the political dimensions of climate broadly. So let's start. And by the way, hearing your voice on a podcast I'm recording, I've got to resist the temptation to go into Zane Velji mode. I was going to say, let's move to our first segment. Our first segment, BC. Can climate be a winning issue for NDP candidates in the BC election? And I ask that because there's such a stark contrast between the BC Conservatives, the BC NDP, John Rustad, the leader of the BC Conservatives, David Eby, the premier and head of the BC NDP. John Rustad seems to be an old school climate denialist. While he acknowledges humans have contributed to climate change, he criticizes the climate doom cult. And it seems like it's a big opening for the BC NDP to differentiate themselves. But as David just said, it's kind of climate as a topic has kind of waned amongst voters right now. So going back to it, can it be a winning issue for NDP candidates in that election?
Well, I'm not sure that it can. I mean, right now, the climate has dropped to number 6 in the overall issues. This has turned into a very polarizing issue that has fundamentally changed the elections. I think that sometimes people have overestimated how dramatically people have moved away from climate as a primary issue. But nonetheless, it seems that the cost of living is so high as an issue, and it is so contraindicated to the climate, especially through the carbon tax, which is the primary tool that we've been using to kind of show, because, we can have a big discussion about what is effective and what's not effective. But what we're trying to do in politics is just show our bona fides, right? We're actually doing something. So we're showing through the carbon tax that we're doing something without necessarily achieving anything.
The extraordinary polarization in politics is kind of evident in this huge gap between crisis and denialism. So yeah, John Rustad is a kind of classical climate denialist, but one of the main talking points he has is that there isn't a climate crisis. The climate isn't an acute crisis. And that actually happens to be something that I agree with. I think in many ways you do too, Ed. I think measured by the sort of classic way we measure kind of acuteness of crises, either in their real impacts on people or the way they are playing out in politics, I don't think climate's a crisis. But I think it's a really serious piece of public policy that an environmental and human threat that needs to get engaged. But somehow that middle ground between not a problem at all and not a crisis, the middle ground at which reality actually lives, is one that's not getting sufficiently addressed.
Yeah, and we actually had a really interesting show a few seasons back with Andrew Weaver, who for a time was the head of the Green Party of BC, and he was part of that supply and confidence agreement between the BC Greens and the NDP. What I should have said is that he is first and foremost a climate scientist about running on scientific fact versus running on good sound bites. And he talked about the tension there. So I do agree with you, David, in that climate change is not a crisis, say, on the order of nuclear war being a crisis, or even I'm deeply concerned about AI and AI polluting the internet commons. I think that's a tremendous crisis, and I'm heartened by what the legislation in California now, where they're actually trying to put some guardrails on AI. But going back to Stephen, I don't know if you can successfully run on climate being an issue and as a real point of differentiation, unless you're pressing that fear button, unless you're referring to it as a crisis instead of, well, it's a big public policy issue that we should tackle.
Especially in campaigns. Kim Campbell once said that campaigns were no time to be talking about the issues. That is, in fact, true. We talk about the issues that the people want us to talk about, not about the issues that are real or that they're pressing. We talk about things that people care about. It's one of the things that I think has gone horribly wrong with the Trudeau government, is they continue to talk about things that we didn't ask for. No one really asked for the pharmacare program. No one really asked for dental. Childcare worked really well, but that was now 5 years ago, right? So things have shifted. Things are different. Everybody right now wants us to be talking about, the cost of living, the cost of housing. Those are the issues that have become urgent and crises. And so those are the ones that are going to get the attention.
I'd love to pick up, you'd mentioned things that have gone horribly wrong for the Trudeau government. It seems like we have a litany of those things recently, not least of which is recent by-election results in Verdun in Montreal. I forget the full name of the riding, and then Toronto St. Paul earlier in the summer. But one of the things that's gone horribly wrong is the consumer-facing carbon tax. And full disclosure, I was part of that environmental NGO crowd that pushed for it, that really celebrated. We're on the sidelines with the pom-poms when we first got it in Alberta with the Notley government. And then later with the Pan-Canadian Climate Framework, the federal government committed to it in December 2016. And we thought, here we are, we've got it. It's going to be sticky. We're doing what all the economists have told us to do. And it's not a left-right issue because it's just smart. Well, fast forward to today, and the latest progressive leader to capitulate on it is David Eby, the BC NDP premier. And following the lead of Jagmeet Singh, who I thought really cynically announced that he was now against the consumer-facing carbon tax on the eve of those two by-elections, all major Alberta NDP leadership candidates were against it. I say that, although I really don't know where Naheed Nenshi stands on it. I suspect that he would be against it. And with all this capitulation, there's been no political consequences for those progressive leaders for doing so. I haven't seen a major environmental NGO, and I'll say like the one I used to run, the Pembina Institute, has got up and really made a politician pay for that. So back to Stephen, how and why did proponents of the consumer-facing carbon tax fail to really make it a politically resilient policy tool?
Well, I think that the number one problem was you mentioned listening to the economists. Economists are not political scientists, and political science is a different, type of understanding. How the electorate works is something that is fluid. It doesn't just stay constant. And anytime you have polarization in government or polarization in politics, it is ripe for picking an issue that was settled and taking it and turning it around. Roe versus Wade was pretty much settled. I mean, if you looked at the polls. It was not something that people were, edging for. But nonetheless, in the United States, they went after it. People go after things that they think can become wedge issues. And this is one of those things. It was never particularly popular with the right wing, even though it was supposed to be. And even the left, when the progressives jumped in on it and it became the solution for the left, it was actually a right wing solution masquerading as a left wing solution. And that made it, really easy, I think, for people to not be 100% committed to it. And ultimately, we're still a small economy with a small impact. And people were able to say, well, why am I paying for this when we're not really making any significant difference? And when you couple that with a cost of living crisis, suddenly that which was all agreed to and understood becomes a significant political liability. And if the Liberals had had any sense at all, they would have used this last 3-year term to change the way we looked at carbon. But they were just absolutely stuck on a previous solution instead of moving to where the population is. And say what you will about democracy. Democracy is about reflecting where the population is, not necessarily about leading the population where they need to go.
I wonder if there's an interesting analogy to the debate about import tariffs in the U.S. So the left likes to see the businesses taxed, tax the polluters. And of course, anybody who knows any econ, indeed any sensible regular has to understand that if you tax the industries, they'll pass the taxes on. If you're taxing industry that is relatively inflexible demand, for air traffic or electricity or whatever, you put carbon price on the industry. It's not really functionally that different from putting carbon prices on consumers because consumers end up paying, but somehow it appears politically utterly different because you're not taxing the industry. And the same way, Trump has kind of, at least with some of his acolytes, many of them clearly got away with advocating these huge tariffs because tariff on China somehow feels different than a tax on Americans, even though there's really no difference. I mean, a Chinese tariff is the American government putting a price on things that you buy from China at Walmart. It's really a tax, but it somehow doesn't sound that way.
Yeah, the population loves to be fooled. Right? The population loves magicians, right? When we're watching magicians, everything gets exciting because, we don't understand the sleight of hand. And we'll watch it over and over and over again. Well, politicians sometimes need to be magicians. Trump is an expert at it. Trump will blame someone else for the mistakes that he's making. And people will lovingly follow that misdirect. This is the misdirect of climate change, right? Right now we're all responsible for producing CO2. We should all pay the price of CO2. But, where do we can change the way that we do that, and it will look like I'm not paying the price of CO2 anymore. If we went to a producer model, people would be thrilled overnight, even though the cost would probably be higher, because they're not just going to pass on the cost. They're going to pass on the cost with a profitability model.
So, Stephen, I'd love to go back to your political past when you ran Alison Redford's campaign. One of the things in that election was infamously, and my old colleague Dan Vinelovich, it was his dad who asked Danielle Smith in the CBC audience, is climate change real? And she equivocated in her answer. So tell me, going back, and this is a time when Alberta had an industrial carbon price and had an industrial carbon price going back to 2008 with the Stelmach government. So in that election, how did you deal with climate? And did you even talk about this industrial carbon price at the time?
We weren't interested in pricing at the time. What we were far more interested in is it real and is it human cost? And there were definitively two different sides of that question. There was a relatively small subsection, say around 30-40%, that believed that climate change wasn't even real in 2011, 2012. But there was a much larger group that you could tackle that was kind of left and center that, kind of a more pragmatic audience that says, yeah, you know what? This looks like it's real and it looks like we caused it. We were catching up with the rest of the country. The rest of the country was in the 60th, 70th percentile on is climate change real. We were still, languishing behind. So we chose the climate change is real side because we, liked science. And we also had a little bit more on Danielle. We also knew that Danielle didn't even accept evolutionary principles.
You have to just shake your head and cry about the way that not just in Alberta, but Western democracies seem to just lose track of the difference between stuff that people just know unequivocally from things that are genuinely uncertain. I mean, climate change, just the fact that it's warmed over the last century is, more or less as certain a scientific fact as is gravity. The idea that there's, of course, I know you're right, but the idea that there's a substantial fraction of people who deny that really shows the way there's just a willingness to deny kind of really basic factual things and inability to distinguish things for which there's legitimate debate. For example, I think there's completely legitimate debate about what we ought to do about climate change, about how big a problem it really holds for human societies, about what the winners and losers are. And those are legitimate questions. But the question of whether or not it's there is like a debate about whether there's trees.
Yeah, and people, if you dismiss the overwhelming scientific evidence revolution, you pretty dismiss all science to do with biology and right down to molecular biology. But so I do want to, we could have an interesting sidebar just on that, on conspiracy theorist lunacy, and David's got lots of stories to tell there. But let's go into our second segment. Our second segment, the U.S., and I want to say about the U.S. and to echo what David said earlier on, is there anything more to say apart from that climate is not really a factor in the U.S. election right now?
Well, I remember in the last U.S. election, a number of my friends down in the U.S. were working with PACs, climate-based PACs, right? Where they were actually putting climate first in their communications, in trying to change the way that the outcome went, whether it was at the presidential level, gubernatorial level, or Congress. And those folks aren't working for PACs this year. Right. They're still working for PACs, but they're not working for environmental PACs. Instead, they're working for different groups that are reflecting the needs of today: abortion, immigration, other issues that they're pushing forward. And because climate change it's just not there in the same way. Climate change is, it's almost like, okay, we've accepted that it's real. That's what was asked of us. And now we're not going to do anything about it, but we're going to accept that it's real. Now, the Biden government has done something about it, but the way that it was sold was that they did a big infrastructure bill. Right. That's the way they had to package it in something else in order to slide through your medicine. It was the equivalent of putting an aspirin in a gummy bear.
So the Infrastructure Act, the IRA, which is really the spend a lot of money on climate act, I think the big news in this election is that it's not being seriously attacked. I think it's interesting to think about why, because it's huge. And I think part of the reason is we see from fact, but I think fact does sometimes influence policy, that a lot of the actual money from the IRA is going to Republican red states. And while regular voters in those states may have no idea that their jobs and growth in their community has been partly tied to this spending on, wind and solar and various other projects, I think their leaders do. I think the elites in those Republican states know it, and they do shape what happens. And I think one of the really important things that's happening in climate in this election is it's not a top issue, but it's also not being attacked. And I feel like even in a world where Trump wins and the Republicans take the House and Senate, there will be some changes, but I don't think we lose the core of that climate action. And I got to pile on here. You were sort of saying the minimum is just we've accepted there's a problem. I mean, the actual pace of climate action actually in both countries, as measured by the flow of money into clean energy, is stunningly high. And it's not just the IRA. So there's a way in which this whole debate is different than it was a decade ago, because there's really substantial money going into decarbonization and carbon emissions are coming down.
Yeah, but there's a mix there between the hyper engaged people who are now able to make money, because it is a profitable industry, versus the less engaged voting population. When you're hyper engaged and you've realized, hey, I can make myself $100 million or so doing this stuff, versus the less engaged people who are just walking around trying to figure out how to tie their shoelaces in the morning, let alone worrying about what the climate is doing. There's a difference because of the incentive structure, right? There's now significant incentive to doing these works.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that. So, David, I completely agree that IRA, part of its political resilience is because there are pork barrel benefits in as many, if not more, red states as there are in the blue states. But part those benefits include a lot of inefficient subsidies for biofuels, which gets back to the conversation we were having with climate scientist Andrew Weaver. In order to make things sticky, sometimes you have to do things that really aren't going to budge the needle on climate at all, but they're just going to help to keep an electorate on board.
For sure, a lot of nonsense is happening, but I think a lot of sensible stuff is happening. So in the U.S., there really is this rapid build out of solar and wind capacity. There's the beginning of pathways to really build out the grid. And heck, there's now 2 or 3 serious efforts to restart mothballed nuclear power that will put a couple gigawatts of clean power back on the grid. These are really things that just weren't happening 10 years ago. So I do think it's different in the sense that the real action, and we don't look at RA is very important, but these things flow down to all the public utility commissions, all the way the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulator works. That means this stuff is really happening. And I don't want to make it sound like it's all good, but it's happening in a way that I think isn't just at the level of elites who made $100 million. I think regular people see electric vehicles happening, whether they own one or not. They know they're there. They have an opinion about them. They're in the news. They see solar installations. So I think it's just tangibly different than it was.
Stephen, I want to go back because I'm glad you mentioned abortion. And obviously it's topical in light of what happened with the Supreme Court and overturning Roe versus Wade. But I think I read this great book, and it was in the 90s, called Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood by an author named Kristen Luker. And it talked about some of the ground game work that was done to make abortion a reoccurring issue from election cycle to election cycle, even though most Americans had moved on. Now, obviously, Americans have been brought back in because of this overturning of Roe versus Wade. The ground game was, frankly, working with registered Republican, and in this case, women who weren't working. They were what we would call trad wives, I guess. And they had time on their hands to really work this issue and keep it alive with the representatives and their senators and right down to the local level. Looking at the parallels, have climate activists failed to do that, to, kind of make it a ground game issue so that it doesn't oscillate or go up, go down from election to election, that it's a constant, just the way that abortion has been a constant in the U.S.?
Well, I think that you can't look at abortion and you can't look at gay rights. You can't look at a number of these things without looking at religiosity. And religiosity is one of the great definers of partisanship as well, especially in the United States, but it has significant impact even here in Canada. The problem with climate is that there are some with a religious type fervor. There are some climate activists who are nearly religious about their commitment to it. But generally speaking, there is no church of climate. And because there's no church of climate, that religiosity, that push that is put forward that you get when the pastor stands at the pulpit and tells you that you're going to burn in hell if you don't call your congressman. That's lost in the climate debate, but is not lost in things like the LGBTQ movement. I mean, we're going to probably in the future see a backsliding on LGBTQ issues, the same way that we've seen a backsliding. Trans is just, for example, the thin edge of the wedge on LGBTQ issues. We're watching trans get used. And then as soon as we get a wedge in on trans, watch for a bigger wedge to come in the same way that we see that with abortion and guns. Guns have also taken on the same religious fervor. We don't have that kind of religious fervor, period, in Canada. That's just lovely. We're quite lucky in that regard. But without religious fervor on the climate side, I just don't think you're going to have that ability to keep throwing these things in. We will periodically muster the strength to bring it forward, but we're not going to have that year to year, election to election ability to sustain significant climate pressure. It's just not. It doesn't have that religious fervor.
I think there's an interesting political lesson you can learn from the gun story. So liberals in the U.S. like to complain that, of course, it's true by polling that most people in the U.S. would like to have stronger gun laws. But while they would like to have them, it's not ranked very high on their list of what they like. Whereas you have some smaller group, maybe 30%, who think that gun rights and gun freedom are the most important thing. And, the kind of liberal view on that topic is this is democracy gone wrong, but I don't think it necessarily is. I think the reality in democracies is that what often matters is a small group, doesn't need to be a majority, who puts a topic consistently number one. And that has a big role in policy. And it's more important, perhaps, to have 30% of the population who has a topic as number one than to have 80% of the topic who, the population who cares about a topic, but it's, number 26. And I think that that's something that is reflected in the difference between, thinking about the kind of guns and climate analogy. So the reason the U.S. doesn't have stronger gun laws is there's just this body of people who really care about it. And the rest of us don't care that much the other way. And I think in climate, what we need to have more sustainable climate action is not to have 70% of people say, yeah, climate's important. I'd sort of like to see something happen. But when they really think about trade-offs, they don't want to have much happen. I think what we need is to have, say, 30% of people who really see it as a crucial voting issue, where if they don't see action, they won't vote.
Yeah. And the fact that climate is number 6 as a top concern. Sorry, which poll was that, Stephen?
It's Abacus data.
Okay.
Yeah, Abacus is a well-respected pollster.
For sure. It's number 6. I remember it during our pre-chat yesterday. David and I were both surprised, actually, that it was that high. But now for our third segment, pivoting to the Canadian federal scene, climate was a top 3 or top 5 issue back in 2019 and 2021, I think. And since then, we've had the rise of Pierre Poilievre, who is the vast odds-on favorite to be our next prime minister. I would mention John Rustad in BC, who's an old school climate denialist. And we've got a very beaten Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada, and seemingly a leader, a prime minister who doesn't want to resign as leader. Is there some kind of grand move that he can make to use climate to his advantage whenever the next federal election is? And I want to qualify. He's not going to win. The Liberal Party is not going to win. I think the Liberal Party could be headed by Jesus Christ himself and they'd still be beaten by, 15 points or so. But they may not lose as badly. Is there something that he can do that will then help to stem, the bleeding when they actually have the next election?
Well, I think that you need to move to something where it appears that you're going to screw someone else and make me happy. One of the things that I would move to is a polluter pay model without a revenue redistribution. I'd move to a polluter pay model, and then I'd take all of that money and pay for all kinds of different goodies. They can be climate related goodies or they can be unrelated goodies, but you got to move to, if you want to have anything vaguely resembling a successful climate policy right now, you have to have a good guy, me, I'm a good guy, and you have to have a bad guy, that guy. That guy over there has to be the bad guy. And if you don't white hat and black hat this, you're never going to succeed on this policy. The problem with a front-facing climate tax, carbon tax, is that as soon as you put it on it, I'm the bad guy. I have to wear the black hat. And in politics, that doesn't work as well. So I think that what we need to see is flip the switch. He has enough time to do this. Even if the first step is just to end the front-facing carbon tax and move it instead to a series of regulations that will ultimately generate a polluter pay model. And then I would just so quickly remove that revenue neutral thing, people's heads would spin.
It strikes me that part of Trudeau's challenge is it does appear to lots of Canadians that he does kind of think he's Jesus Christ. And that attitude, I think, is part of the problem and reason he's not successful. So maybe coupling those two things, are you saying, Steve, that if he actually really backed down from the consumer price and kind of owned it, like said it was a mistake, which is not a word that you expect much from Trudeau or Jesus Christ, that actually would help to kind of anchor and turn things around if they then turned it around to have a good guy and a bad guy, as you say?
So in politics, we often recommend the double down. When you make a mistake, double down on it. Just do not ever admit that you made a mistake. We're now at the quadruple double down, we've reached exponential levels of doubling down on this tax, and it's not working. People are not going to remember the climate rebate. I think there's a large group of the population that doesn't notice it, and a smaller group of the population for whom it actually matters, and that's a real problem. If the election becomes a carbon tax election versus a climate change election, a climate change election is winnable. A carbon tax election is not. Period. And Ed, I disagree a little bit on how people's minds can change, and there is a pathway to a different government that isn't Pierre Poilievre led. But that pathway either goes through such a significant change by Trudeau that no one recognizes him. I mean, his commitment to himself is notable. And I guess it's probably because he hasn't surrounded himself with anybody who says the word no, sir. I'm sorry, sir. No. It looks like when Jeremy Broadhurst left, he had said, no, I don't think we can win this. And, Jeremy's out on the street looking for a gig. Maybe we can have him on the podcast next time,
Yeah. He's got the longest serving chief of staff to a prime minister by a country mile in Katie Telford. Now, so one idea, and hear me out on this, because getting rid of the consumer facing carbon tax, I get it. I've had chats, including with leadership candidate Raki Pancholi before she folded her tent and then threw her chips in with Naheed Nenshi, which ended up being very wisely so. You said you can get rid of it and you can replace it. However, we're getting rid of it just at a time when the price is starting to tick up at a level that behavioral economists will tell us it will change behavior. And if you get rid of it, you blow a big hole. Here's one idea. If you're to keep it in place, just as it's starting to actually work, and then you say, okay, well, in return, I'm going to drop the GST. What about a grand move like that?
I mean, you could do something like that. That's an interesting one, but the economics of that are totally disproportionate, right? The amount that you're making on the carbon tax is disproportionate to the amount that you're getting from your GST. So I think you could probably drop, and this is off, me, looking at the numbers in my head, so I could be way off, but I think you could drop the GST maybe 2 points on the carbon tax revenue, and then you'd have to do away with the revenue neutral side. I don't think you're going to get any pickup on a 2-point drop on the GST.
Like Ed, I argued for the carbon tax. I was part of the kind of a DIA circle of advisors who put it on the map and have all these arguments that, income taxes are taxed to discourage employment, and a carbon tax is a tax to discourage emissions, and we should tax shift, and we should get out of the crony capitalism, picking winners, and just let the market do it. We have this whole set of phrases that I do think are actually wise, but I buy what you're saying, that at this point, as much as I think Ed might be rationally correct, it feels like the only way the Trudeau government saves this is to step away from the consumer tax, which after all is only one of several things they have, and step away from it sharply by just admitting that we're wrong.
I don't think there's anybody in that government who's prepared to stand up right now and say that. I know that they're looking for a new national campaign director. And if the person who takes that job needs to be in a position to say, I need something that is going to shake this election so dramatically that we can put ourselves on the map again. I'm not sure that there's anybody in the government who's prepared to shake the tree hard enough to actually get the fruit.
So climate is back to being a partisan issue. And I think, I was in Ottawa in June. I went to the launch of that biography of Trudeau called The Prince. At that launch, I bumped into Aaron O'Toole, and we were kind of talking and commiserating. He released a climate plan on the eve of the 2020 election when he was leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. And the climate plan was actually decent. And I remember going on CBC and saying, okay, well, things like consumer-facing carbon tax, it's now post-partisan. He had a weird one. It was the more you burn, the more you earn. It didn't really work, but it was there. He had other, like a national low carbon fuel standard. He had a national ZEV mandate. And I thought, really, okay, we've got Conservatives champion. It's post-partisan. We've broken down the oppositional politics. It's not a left-right divide issue anymore. And then fast forward to today and looking at the politics, it very much is back to being a highly partisan issue in the U.S. and in Canada. How have we failed to remove the oppositional politics from climate?
Well, because ultimately the electorate is selfish, right? And the selfishness of the electorate has to be factored into politics. Like, I think that Aaron O'Toole is a principled man who understands that issues are real and they need to, he needs to deal with them. I'm not sure that Pierre Poilievre deals with things that way. I think that Pierre Poilievre looks for the giant wedges and he sees the selfishness of the population and he's prepared to pick up on it and say, if the people don't want to pay this tax, I don't really care what the consequences are. I'm going to put in, I don't care what the consequences are for defunding the CBC. I don't care what the consequences are for taking away the carbon tax. I'm going to do these things regardless of the outcome, because the selfishness of the electorate tells me that that's where I have to go. And to break through, to actually get heard by the electorate, an electorate that barely pays attention. I call it the give a fuck factor. It's super low on climate. So why wouldn't you? Because there's no cost, there's no consequence. And the you mentioned right off the top, where are the NGOs? I mean, there were campaigns, there was money being spent, there were real initiatives underway in the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, and they're gone now. Right. And so what is it that we're trying to achieve, and who do we think is going to achieve it for us?
Stephen's answer, your answer seemed to be selfishness, and that's sort of the answer for why it's so partisan now. And that feels true. I mean, people are selfish, not disagreeing, but it doesn't feel sufficient, because the UK is similar to Canada in lots of ways, and yet it's clear that climate isn't so partisan there. And I don't think the explanation is people in the UK are inherently less selfish. I'm, as a Canadian, not willing to say that. I want to assume the underlying selfishness is about the same. And yet it really feels like the way it's played out has been different. So I guess I want to hear a little more. Not disputing that people are selfish, but that's not the whole explanation.
No, but I think that I did overlay a significant difference, and that significant difference, it would be the same to me if Boris Johnson was running again. The individual who chooses to lead up the other side with Pierre Poilievre is possibly one of the most wicked politicians I've ever seen, and wicked in a couple of different contexts. He literally doesn't care. Right. He is only interested in achieving power. He's a lifelong political operative that started, I've been working in and around Pierre Poilievre for 25 years. This guy's been around politics, and he has been a detrimental force in politics in every one of those 25 years. He is absolutely willing to sell his soul in order to achieve power. And I think that might be, and I'm not close enough to the political leaders in the UK, but I suspect that there is a difference in the individual, and the individual who chooses to sell us a bad I think that Danielle Smith falls into this category in Alberta. John Rustad, I think, falls into the category where there are certain political leaders that are willing to reflect back to us our very worst. And there are others who are not willing to reflect back our very worst. And I would put Aaron O'Toole into that category.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I would say that, Jason Kenney was no climate devotee, but I can't imagine for a second the Jason Kenney government putting in place the moratorium on new renewable electricity development that Danielle Smith put in place. And from talking to a former top renewables executive just earlier this week, it has still gutted the industry, and capital has just flown outside the province. Going back to this kind of compare and contrast with the UK and Canada. So, David, it's a good point. There didn't seem to me to be a lot of daylight between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak on climate in the last election. I think it was more a matter of nuance than anything. But when David Cameron took over from Gordon Brown, I didn't see a huge difference in climate policy. And I still saw the British High Commission willing to, now to a lesser degree, but still willing to flex its diplomatic muscles on climate policy, even here in Canada, to the point where it's being accused of being interventionist. So you had a leader like that, and terrible conservative leaders, but none of them ran on a platform of, we're not going to do this. It's a waste of money. Climate isn't an issue. And yet we have that here in Canada. So I guess, what do we need to do in Canada so that we can sort of borrow from the UK and make climate a post-partisan issue?
Well, I think that one of the things that I remember, I worked with a gentleman who'd been in oil and gas in London, and then had been in oil and gas in Calgary. And the difference that he said is that, we have these population bases in Calgary where the oil and gas industry becomes, is significant percentage of the industry. It becomes dominant, right? And because it becomes dominant, it gets too much power. And I think that in Canada, the oil and gas industry just has too much power, and that power is exerted in multiple ways. And, when the big guys are exerting their power, they're exerting their power in kind of a climate model that is achievable. But here in Canada, we had the little guys step up. the little guys took over when they elected, and they put themselves behind Pierre Poilievre, and they put themselves behind Danielle Smith, and they put themselves behind John Rustad. And these little guys that scrape and claw just to succeed, just to survive, they are 100% climate denialists, and they are electing people who reflect that view. In the United Kingdom, I remember my buddy saying, it was like 1% of the economy. It was just another industry in a large country, and it doesn't have that same kind of ability to push an agenda. And we have an industry that pushes an agenda here in Canada, especially in Alberta. We are a significant player in the economy of Canada, and we are willing to flex our muscle. And it impacts Canada.
Economic self-interest is profoundly explanatory here. I mean, Alberta is almost a barrel a day per capita, and not many other places in the entire world are that oil dependent economically. And so, of course, it's different. And I think the combination of that, having one province and also having provinces be relatively more powerful than there's no kind of UK equivalent. So that plus the barrel per day per capita in Alberta is a big part of the explanation. I want to offer another explanation that I think also is relevant, which is maybe political topics are more stable in democracies when the compromises kind of happen from the surprising side. So Nixon going to China and recognizing the communist state, Bill Clinton reducing a bunch of old-fashioned welfare, or George Bush decommissioning nuclear weapons, intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Europe. Those are all things where there was sort of a political pill that the elites knew had to be swallowed, but the leader that swallowed it was from kind of the unexpected side. And I think in the UK, a bunch of climate policy happened under conservatives, and I think that made it more conservative. And that says there is no fix in Canada except a time machine where you go back to imagine some Canadian world with a moderate conservative had some climate policies, and then that would be more stable, but we can't go back.
Yeah, moderation is a great word too, David. We haven't seen a lot of moderation in Canada since Erin O'Toole. And that exists across the provinces as well as, Doug Ford might be the last progressive conservative premier. And it's Doug Ford. We're not looking at a guy who's necessarily at the top of the top of the game.
Yeah, we can't say too many nice things about Doug Ford because I'll get heated emails from my mom, Stephen. So we got to be careful. So those are great points comparing and contrasting between Canada, the UK, or Alberta and the UK. I remember talking to the guy who was heading Total's Canada wing, Total, the big French oil and gas major. And he was sharing stories just after he arrived in Alberta. And he said he had worked in 9 different countries up until that point. And he said in every country, even, sub-Saharan African countries, South American countries, when you arrive, you'll meet with a regulator early on and they'll say, well, you can't do this, you can't do that. If you do that, then we're going to shut you down, etc. He said he came to Alberta and the bureaucrats and the regulators said, what can we do to help you? And then he said he realized that it was captured, that Alberta was truly captured by the oil and gas industry.
No, we are owned by them, and we will continue to be owned by them as long as we rely on the revenue instead of paying our own way. But that's a different topic for a different podcast. It is a fascinating thing that we choose to use these one-time royalties to finance our everyday operating expenditures.
Yeah. Well, we pivoted away from accolades to Doug Ford to more familiar ground and beating up on the oil and gas sector.
This is a really interesting conversation, and I wish that climate stays at the top of my priorities. I wish it was at the top of more political operatives.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Amit Tandon, with help from Crystal Hickey. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President, Research, and the university's Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trottier Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, the Palmer Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. Before Sarah went on leave, she and I were able to squeeze in a conversation about new research that Sarah and her University of Calgary colleagues Aviv Fried and Blake Schaefer conducted into EV owner behavior around level 1 and level 2 charging. We'll drop that show next, followed by a special live taping of Energy versus Climate at the Energy Disruptors Conference in Calgary on October 1st. Keep an ear out for both of them.